Checking sound real quick. It is Thursday, February 27th, 2020. My name is Shashank RK, and this is the RK Roundup. Coming at you from the heart of Brooklyn, New York, from the last time, actually. This is my last chance to broadcast before a big move into Manhattan. So next time I come at you, it's going to be from the heart of the city, or the outskirts, because gentrification. Today on the show, let's see, talking about a big debate win for Sanders, has the best performance polling. We're going to be talking a little bit about the violence in India and the anti-Muslim pogrom that is happening right now in New Delhi, and how the Indian media is biased towards this fair reporting that isn't reflective of the really, really one-sided violence taking place right now. We're going to pivot from there onto the ideological and political differences between Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, and talk a little bit in a little bit in detail about, Freudian slip there, a little bit in detail about Elizabeth Warren, why she's good for the progressive movement, and why her presidential race is bad for all of us. And, we're going to touch on the DNC, the whole superdelegate scandal. They're plotting against Bernie. And going to finish off with a feel-good story, a little viewer comment response, and also just a final pep talk on how we beat Trump and how that is very, very difficult a task. It's going to be very difficult. It's very unlikely that we're going to beat Trump. And there is one person who is equipped to do the job above all others. And I think you know who that person is. Just going to take a sip of water real quick. Usually save this for the breaks, but I'm a little caffeine dry. And we get started with the first topic, of course, the South Carolina debate. We're about to go into a big primary in 2 days' time from broadcast. And Bernie won. Nobody thinks it was his strongest debate performance, but it was his highest stakes debate performance. It was the most important for him to perform, and he performed enough. He met a higher standard at a time where he was the subject of every single attack, and he came out with his head strong because the truth is, he is not as vulnerable or attackable on his personality or his record or what specific things he said. For example, they tried to smear him on a completely reasoned and rational comments on Cuba, where he said, I denounce authoritarianism. Obviously, Fidel Castro is a brutal dictator. I'm not, I don't like Castro as an authoritarian leader. I don't like dictators, and I don't like authoritarians. But it is important to acknowledge when a government does something right. And the education program in Cuba is could have been implemented in a outside of the context of an authoritarian government. You can learn lessons from the education program, similar to how, like, for example, a great analog for this is there's a criminal justice reform bill, a prison reform bill that got passed by the Trump administration. That's a bill that was passed completely independent of the White House. Maybe like the optics of it were improved because, the Trump White House was able to basically pushed it essentially to win over black voters. But they pushed it through, and none of Trump's neo-fascist or proto-fascist tendencies at all helped him pass the prison reform bill. It is important to acknowledge that people that we fundamentally and morally oppose can still do good things, and we can learn from those good things while being opposed to the institution itself. And every government works this way. So Bernie makes his remarks on Cuba, and he defends them, and he doesn't actually get dragged down for them, because at the end of the day, his campaign is about issues. You can't drag him down on one thing he said. You can't drag him down on an aspect of his personality. Nobody cares if nobody in Washington likes Bernie, because ultimately he fights for issues. He pushes the pendulum. He pushes the narrative, and good things get done because of the democratic movements that he enables. Medicare for all is on the table because of him, because he does not stop talking about issues. He does not stop talking about the people he is trying to benefit, the people he is trying to advocate for, the people he is fighting for. That is all that matters to him, and thus it's all that matters to people who are considering voting for him. So, yeah, that's a fair summary of his performance at the debate. He just kept on talking about issues. People made dishonest, bad faith attacks about Medicare for all. They made dishonest, bad faith attacks about free college, or rather, tuition-free public college, to be precise. Nothing's free. He has never said healthcare is free. He has never said that college is free. He said that public colleges will be tuition-free. They will be paid for by taxes. Medicare for all will be paid for by taxes. We're going to eliminate premiums, copays, and deductibles. We're going to talk more about healthcare during a later broadcast. It might be a prepared content video, sorry, because I don't really have time to cover it today because I have to move a bunch of stuff, unfortunately. But it's going to be a longer form video, whether I do it live or do it pre-recorded. And I'm going to try and do it on the sooner side, as soon as I can find a place, because I'm not going to have a desk in my new place. But the point is that ultimately, Bernie has every single value placed in the right place. All of his issues, all of his policy platforms engage the correct problems and give populist-friendly solutions that, whether or not they're the best way of addressing the problem, they identify the problem extremely effectively, and they don't make pretenses about knowing what kind of government we're going to be working with in a year's time, in 2 years' time, in 3 years' time. The point of these policies is to address the issue. I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of which of Bernie's policies I support, which of them I oppose, because what matters is that ideologically he identifies the problem masterfully. And that's the main point. Medicare for all addresses all of the structural issues in American healthcare. It is the best and simplest way to do so. Whether we go to a different universal healthcare program that is viable, that's a question for 2 years, 3 years from now. The point is, we aim for the simplest and easiest to achieve form of universal healthcare as we see it now. We can adapt along the way, but our end goal cannot change. It is universal healthcare. For that, you need to curb the power of private insurance. You need to curb the power of the pharmaceutical industry. You need to curb the power of the pharmaceutical industry in setting prices, which every multi-payer system in the world already does. Multi-payer systems in Belgium and France, the government sets the price, or a governmental organization sets the price. Pharmaceutical industries don't negotiate their own prices. Mutualities don't get to choose what premiums that they charge. These are determined for them. That's why multi-payer systems work in Europe. They are more government intervention. And the best way to erode pharmaceutical power, to erode private health insurance power, is to nationalize health insurance and to aim for the nationalization of health insurance. Hiccups, issues, things that we learn about better structural ways to achieve the end goal, that is stuff we can learn along the way, and we can make adjustments as needed. But right now, we aim for what we want, which is universal healthcare, premium-free, copay-free, deductible-free. Deductibles are morally indefensible. Copays and premiums exist around the world, but you start at zero and you build them based on the minimum, the absolute minimum that you can charge that will allow you to have a functional system. This is all wonk stuff. Right now, Medicare for all. That's what we aim for. That's what we aim for. That's what we pass. It's what we ramp up to. So he fought on that issue. He came out standing. Any attacks on Medicare for all are presuming to know what system we're going to be working with, what hiccups we're going to face along the way, or you're presuming that we're going to face the maximum number of hiccups and it's not worth going for in the first place. That's the point of the public option, is that it builds on an Affordable Care Act that is fundamentally flawed in that it doesn't challenge the power that is preventing healthcare from being universal. So Sanders took those attacks. Warren came out, and this is the Warren that I love to see, came out just slamming Bloomberg over and over and over again. I was going to do a podcast on Bloomberg sometime last week, but unfortunately, I work 4 jobs. And honestly, I'm preaching to the choir, and it's a broken record. Like, don't vote for Michael Bloomberg. We'll talk more about it later, but don't vote for Mike Bloomberg. Um, and we'll talk more during a later segment, but don't vote for Bloomberg. Don't vote for Bloomberg. If you vote for Bloomberg, Trump wins. That's it. If Bloomberg's nominated, Trump wins. The other thing that I noticed as a result of the Democratic debate on, I guess it was on Tuesday. It was on Tuesday. The other thing I noticed as a result of the Tuesday debate was, and also as a result of Nevada, which was also a huge win for Bernie, needless to say, is that the media is starting to polarize, right? You've got, obviously, like Chuck Todd comparing Bernie to brown shirts. Still waiting on an apology for that. You've got Jason Johnson going on a Sirius XM show and making disgusting comments about the black women who support Bernie Sanders. He did apologize for that, and it seemed like a fairly okay apology. Chris Matthews as well compared Bernie's Nevada win to the fall of France, to Nazi Germany, who, it is well known, killed various members of Bernie's family. And so Chris Matthews apologized for that. And I appreciate those apologies. And I'm willing to say, you know what, that's good. It's good that you apologize for that. It's good that you're going to be more sensitive in your rhetoric. And it's also good that MSNBC is going out of there, has been reported to be going a little bit further out of their way to hire more progressive commentators and platform more progressive voices. And I was very vocal on that. I don't want Chris Matthews to be fired, though maybe he should consider retiring. I don't want Chuck Todd fired, though I guess I'm ambivalent to Chuck Todd, but I'm not calling for him to be fired. I want the people that will succeed them to live in a more politically diverse environment where their views aren't tainted by the same systems that brought them success. The problem with Chuck Todd is not that he is like indoctrinated against Bernie. It's that he's indoctrinated toward the elite systems that gave him his own success. This is the same reason that I voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016. I am biased toward, like, people should be educated. And by educated, I'm not talking about like generally educated. There's a lot of very educated people who never went to college. There's a lot of really stupid people who went to Ivy League schools. Ben Shapiro went to Ivy League schools. I'm not going to name names, Ben Shapiro, but the point is that academic success and like classical career and technocratic success is not the measure of qualification. It's not the only measure of qualification, and in many cases it stands in the way of actually seeing someone's lack of qualification. I honestly believe this is the case with Pete Buttigieg, who is either not very smart, not very competent. I definitely think he's not competent, but is very, very good at hiding his incompetence behind extremely flowery rhetoric that he's stolen from Obama and stripped of substance. So the point there is that I want mainstream progressive journalism, center-left, left-of-center journalism, to be an environment in which these people who are hired by corporate entities, work in corporate offices, work in professional offices with a bunch of Ivy League educated people, that they're experiencing an enrichment of perspective that allows their likely very well educated minds to make better analyses of power, of justice, of pragmatic solutions to real world problems. That they understand that politics is not a game to someone working 4 jobs and making under poverty wage. So I don't want Chuck Todd to be fired. I want him to have to be surrounded by a dearth of a breadth of voices. I want more Sam Cedar on MSNBC outside of Chris Hayes' show, outside of Ari Melba's show. I want him to go on Hardball, right? I want Alexandra Rojas, who, oh man, I actually wish I'd I wish I'd shown this. I wish I'd actually prepared this clip. But I want Alexandra Rojas with the speech that she made on CNN. I want that on MSNBC. Rojas is a member of the Justice Democrats. She's the executive director, and she's now a commentator on CNN. She's literally like, CNN is more progressive than MSNBC because voices like hers are finally being platformed. And it's really important because she made a long speech, and I'm going to just quote a section of her speech. The people who sit in a lot of our most powerful rooms in the country, pushing forward our news, are not the same level of class. There's a worldview that is vastly different from the everyday voter to who our DC pundits and folks are in the newsroom. She's saying that those worldviews need to be platformed more, and the people in the newsroom need to be exposed to that worldview, exposed to that experience more. And that's really important. And I think that voices at MSNBC are starting to maybe understand that. And we should be shouting out the people who go out of their way, like All In with Chris Hayes, The Beat with Ari Melber. These are shows that regularly try to platform left of corporate center-left voices. And it's important that we hold all shows to that standard. Not by firing the ones that don't meet it, but by reorienting our support, right? Again, I don't want Chris Todd. I don't want Chuck Todd fired. I want Chuck Todd educated. I want Chuck Todd to have his mind opened, and maybe he won't, but the person who succeeds him will. And if we just get Chris Matthews and Chuck Todd fired, it's going to make MSNBC think that the left is at war with them. The truth is that MSNBC is a resource. It's a form of capital, the likes of which the left has never had access to before. Anything that we can do as a left movement, as a progressive movement, to gain access to that resource of a center-left network, of a left-of-center network that reaches a worldwide audience with its message, that is a good outcome. So no, I'm not going to declare war on corporate journalists, on center-left networks that constantly shit on us. I will criticize them, we will call them out, and we're going to implore the good journalists to fight to actually platform progressive voices. And that's the way that you win. That's the way that you get your message platform. That's the way that you mainstream left politics, the way that you mainstream social democracy, the way that you mainstream democratic socialism, is that you remove the stigma by forcing yourself into the narrative with a stern message that holds people accountable, but is still inclusive by saying, like, my problem isn't with you. I'm not going to declare war on you, but your message is toxic, and I'm going to tell you why. So that's starting to happen. You're starting to see people really take off their masks, have to apologize, and it looks like the pressure is coming in downward, right? Johnson had to apologize. Matthews had to apologize. Still waiting on Chuck Todd. And we're seeing more progressives go on these networks, and hopefully more on MSNBC in the future. So now we're going to go outside of our borders, and we're going to talk a little bit about what's going on in India. Basically, earlier this week, Trump touched down in India to visit with the most dangerous fascist in the world, Narendra Modi. Modi, of course, is second only to Jair Bolsonaro, who Bolsonaro is the kind of the clown fascist would-be dictator president of Brazil, who got elected basically based on the political imprisonment of his opponent, Lula da Silva. And Bolsonaro is extremely dangerous only because he is actively burning down the Amazon, which has disastrous implications for our climate, which is the most important issue facing humanity at large. But if not for the geographical convenience, he wouldn't hold a candle to Modi. Modi is the most effective fascist of the modern era. This is somebody who presided over riots that killed tens of thousands of Muslims in Gujarat. And he insulated himself from blame just enough, where he told the police not to intervene in Hindus' right to have their voices heard. Not sure if that's an exact quote, but it's basically what he was saying. He was saying they're protesting. Let them exercise their democratic rights. So the police didn't interfere because Modi told them that, knowing that the protest would turn into riots. You'd have to be a fucking idiot to know that not know that the protest would turn into riots. The riots became an effective religious cleansing, and tens of thousands of Muslims were killed. And he was absolved of wrongdoing on technicalities. It's like a court of law where there was reasonable doubt. This isn't a court of law. This is public opinion, and a commission said there was no wrongdoing. Ever since then, he has continued to insulate himself from blame for the fascistic, anti-Muslim, religious nationalist actions of RSS, which is the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, which basically RSS is the considered the blanket term for the Sangh Parivar, which is the Sangh family. The Sangh family is basically the Hindu nationalist blanket. RSS is the parent organization. The political wing is BJP, who currently rules in India. They have a militant terrorist organization called the Vishnu Hari Parishad Party, which is basically a militant organization, and they actually have a chapter in America that endorses Tulsi Gabbard. And the VHP is their terrorist wing, and then they have various other organizations within that have existed and then gone into obscurity and then come back, like Shiv Sena and a bunch of other parties. And they have wings and remotes in various states. So Modi has consistently presented himself as a reformist who is against Hindu nationalism, or who is against Hindu fascism, but wants to present a nicer side to Hindu nationalism. He's an effective Richard Spencer, if you will. And once he was reelected, once BJP was reelected, the mask came off. Kashmiri independence, or Kashmiri autonomy, was revoked. The Indian Army annexed Kashmir on suspicions of terrorism, knowing that they would be attacked by insurgents, which ramps them up to deprive Muslims of rights. And we talked about that in a previous video, how fascists use foreign policy to, or how fascists use foreign policy as a tool for global, use global foreign policy as a tool for oppressing minorities at home. And I encourage you to check that video out. And it's a perfect analog for what's going on in Kashmir, what's going on with CAA with the Citizenship Amendment. But when Trump came to visit his fascistic friend, Modi, there was an uprising in protests against BJP because they thought, while America's here, it's time to get some international attention. This led to a retaliation from Hindu mobs, who were incited to violence by the very racist rhetoric of BJP and the BJP president Amit Shah, who has referred to non-Hindu immigrants as termites and threatened to throw them into the Bay of Bengal. This is a very, very racist, very anti-Muslim person, completely not dabbling in crypto-fascism like Modi has, but rather just open, unabashed, very, very racist. And so the riots happened, and right now there is effectively a religious pogrom going on against Muslims in Delhi. Now, the Indian media is not going to say it that way. They're going to say clashes, communal clashes and riots. And because local media reports it that way, because India is not a land in which the press is encouraged to report on news accurately, but rather they're biased toward not having bias. They're biased toward fairness, to steal a Sorkin-esque term. Indian media will never ever say the ruling party is effecting an ethnic cleansing, because, quite frankly, there's their physical safety to consider, that there will be physical and violent retaliation against said press. And it's not politically convenient, and it's just a very corrupt political culture. Where even I have centrist relatives who don't support BJP, but they get very offended when I say, listen, this is not a two-sided issue. Hindus are killing Muslims. Hindus are oppressing Muslims in Kashmir. They're oppressing Muslims in the borderline northeast, the border northeast, in the border states. And centrists get very offended because they are conditioned to believe that any one-way criticism is inherently biased, is inherently untrustworthy, that you have to have a two-sided critique in order to be making an accurate one. But in this case, no. It's just Hindus are in power, and they are killing Muslims right now in Delhi. And this is Amit Shah's disgusting and repulsive rhetoric that he is doing in revenge for having lost the capital city. His party, that he's the president of, holds a huge majority in the Indian parliament. And it's very embarrassing that they don't hold the capital city. But, you know, it's a pretty decent analog for America. Washington, D.C. is never going to vote Republican. But we have a Republican majority in the Senate, Republican White House, and we had a Republican majority in all of Congress until last year, right? Delhi isn't reflective of what all of India thinks, and Modi isn't reflective of what Delhi thinks. But right now, what Delhi is showing is an immense amount of racism and a willingness to harness incredible power in horrendous ways, in horrifying ways. And the Indian media is not going to report on it in an accurate way. You have to take cues. You have to understand. You have to read between the lines. John Oliver, on Last Week Tonight, made a deep dive episode on Narendra Modi and what led him to be in power, the problems with him, how Hindu nationalism is affecting India. I haven't seen the segment in question, but it comes recommended to me by everyone who's seen it, whose opinion I respect. That episode was censored in India. It got pulled by Disney over protests from Hindu subscribers. Which there's a different conversation about how Disney is willing to literally suppress Indian free speech in order to protect its market share. And you should cancel your Disney Plus subscription immediately to hold them accountable. And no, it doesn't matter that Baby Yoda is cute. He's a front for fascism. Literally, Baby Yoda is a front for suppressing Indian free speech right now. Because Disney literally censored, legitimately, like actually, Disney censored a political critique because it offended some people. This is the definition of free speech violation. Of course, we have some of that going on here with certain news reporters saying that they believe in certain tenets of democratic socialism and getting fired for it, which is the definition of manufacturing consent. But the point is that the Indian media landscape is extremely toxic, and it's very problematic. It's very scary. And you have to read between the lines to understand what is not properly being reported on. When you watch reports, like BBC reports and the like, you'll notice. You'll see faces of Muslim Indians saying, you know, I've been beaten up, talking about their experience. And then you'll see the head of a Hindu mob. And the Hindu mob face is blurred. The person is anonymous. And they're just saying, like, we're not going to let these people, like, the Muslims came at the cops and we decided to protect them. And talking in abstractions and pablum and platitudes. It's important to note that the Hindu faces are anonymous. The Muslim faces are open. They're uncovered, pleading to the world to help. You have to understand who is being duplicitous here. And the easiest way to do that is to note who has the power. Muslims don't have the power in Delhi. Yes, BJP lost. BJP lost because of the centrist vote. The centrists aren't going to come out and get their asses kicked protecting. And if they try, they're just going to be spared by the Hindu mobs. They don't have power to protect anyone. The problem is that while Hindu fascists are a minority, and we're foreshadowing another topic, Hindu fascists are not a majority of the Delhi populace, but they are a plurality. And they outnumber any individual group that gets in their way. So when they go after Muslims and they beat the shit out of them, and the media comes in and they're forced to report very, very balanced. Oh, it's communal clashes. That's not what's going on. Hindus have the power in India. They're starting the fights. It is time to be clear about who is at fault and who is not. And that is one of the big differences between Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. Which is going to segue into our next topic. But I'm going to read out the statements that they had to make about the violence against Muslims in India. Warren said, these are their tweets. Their campaigns tweeted these statements. It's important to strengthen relationships with democratic partners like India, but we must be able to speak truthfully about our values, including religious freedom and freedom of expression, and violence against peaceful protesters is never acceptable. She didn't mention which side was inciting and enacting the vast majority of the violence. Bernie Sanders' statement. Over 200 million Muslims call India home. Widespread anti-Muslim mob violence has killed at least 27 and injured many more. Trump responds by saying, that's up to India. This is a failure of leadership on human rights. This exhibits every difference between Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren as politicians. Bernie understands power, and he understands the role power plays in responsibility and accountability. Warren does not understand power. Very clearly not. Her entire success line has entailed an even playing field because of her qualifications on the merits, because she's a very effective politician in the areas in which she's effective. And the changes that she's enacted, she has done in the face of incredible adversity. As a result, she considers herself an institution, which in many cases she is. But she doesn't understand that most of the world is not like her. They're not uniquely situated as people, especially educated in the exact area of law, in order to stand against an overwhelming opposition force. And this is the situation that faces Muslims in Delhi, in Punjab, especially in the Northeast. Muslim Indians are outnumbered everywhere. And they are Indians. Their families have been there since partition, and even if they hadn't, it wouldn't fucking matter. These are people who were born in this country, who were born here, or who came here fleeing persecution to a secular country. This is all of their homes. I'm part of a Facebook portal on for South Indians across the world. And we recently got a message from someone. I'm not going to quote the message or say who, but the in effect the message was, I'd like to express my appreciation as a Muslim for how well Hindus in Tamil Nadu, which is the state that my family's from, how well the Muslims in Tamil Nadu are treated. That we feel safe, we feel secure here, and we feel at home here. And I understand they're trying to express gratitude, but you should never have to be explicitly thankful for that in your own home. That message was phrased as if from a guest. No. You own this house with us. No one should ever have to feel that unsafe. It is a moral travesty that this violence is allowed to go on. And if you support BJP, knowing that this violence is happening, if you willingly delude yourself into thinking this is a two-sided conflict, you are supporting fascism. You are on the wrong side of history. You are voting for the Nazi Party. That's what you're doing. BJP is the strongest analog to the Third Reich that exists. It is a slow escalation of the deprivation of Muslim rights, of religious minority rights. There is a non-Christian Abrahamic religion that exists in prominence in a country. It is being deprived of its rights on an escalating basis. It would be not sensational. It would be crying wolf to say that this is India's night of broken glass. Because it's not. Or if it is, it's the third or fourth one. There have been riots and riots and riots. The demolition of Babri Masjid. That was one. The riots going on right now. That was one. The rape and murder of an 8-year-old girl because she was a Muslim. That was one. We're beyond that. This isn't fascism taking power. This is fascism doing with power as it sees fit. It's important to strengthen relationships with democratic partners like India. Anybody that needs that preface to your statement in order to take you seriously is not an ally. It's not somebody whose alliance is worth protecting. Our alliances should be based on a fundamental minimum of human rights that India has gone way and above violating. This is the country my family came from. This is a country I visit every few years, if not every year. Now, I go to a place that's much more forward-thinking. I'm privileged to do that. I go to a place where Muslims are treated well, where religious minorities are treated with dignity. There's plenty of other problems. My joke is that South India basically traded racism for sexism, which is the more serious problem in South India. But you cannot kiss the ass of an ally that is enacting an act of genocide. They are escalating toward religious ethnic cleansing. They have been for years. And you don't have to recognize it the whole time. That's the beauty of BJP. Use beauty in terms of the political effectiveness of BJP. Is that Modi had everyone fooled. Or not fooled. He had us doubting, right? I didn't know until last year that Modi's a fascist. I suspected. It was a creeping feeling. It's like, okay, he might be. He might be a reformist. He might be a fascist. He needs to be accountable. He played on that confusion so that nobody took action. Well, now the mask is off. We know what he is. We know what BJP is. And anyone who continues to delude themselves is feeding into and abetting the religious ethnic cleansing and anti-Muslim genocide that is being effected right now. And that includes Elizabeth Warren when she makes lukewarm statements about basic Muslim rights. On that note, we're going to pivot to a different topic after a brief break. I'm just going to wet my whistle. And we're going to talk about the fundamental difference between Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, with a little bit of a deep dive on who Warren is, why she's my favorite politician, and why I do not support her for president. And we're back. Holy shit. I'm sorry. There is somewhat breaking news. This released today, but I just saw it. Wow. Damn. All right. So apparently, the Washington Post did an analysis of the Bolivian elections in October, which were thrown out due to suspected fraud. And the Washington Post did an analysis, and they said that there was no reason to suspect fraud, and it seemed like the elections themselves were probably legitimate. So Evo Morales, who is the left leader and the Democratic Socialist leader of Bolivia, legitimately elected, was ousted on fraud charges that turned out to be, at best, circumstantial. So I'm going to leave that there because I don't feel comfortable enough talking in depth about Bolivia. But if you're having trouble deciding, does if you're having trouble deciding whether, one second. If you're having trouble deciding whether what's happening in Bolivia or what happened in Bolivia was a coup, it might be that might help you make your decision. Give me 1 second. I'm gonna have to go back to break. And we're back. Apologies for that. I got logged out of Google Drive or something like that, and it was like buggy and bugged. So I just copied it to a different account and should be fine. All right. So obviously I support Bernie Sanders. Big whoop. And I've been I don't like attacking Elizabeth Warren because, quite frankly, like, I'm not interested in left infighting, and I'm not interested in progressive infighting. I'm not interested in anything that jeopardizes a progressive agenda and helps us gain power that we can make positive change with, and that's the most important thing to me. That's why I support Bernie Sanders. That's why I'm not interested in alienating Warren supporters. But what really bothers me is that Elizabeth Warren has continued to exhibit a pattern of behavior that actively jeopardizes the progressive agenda. And that really, really, really bothers me because I am someone who genuinely admires Warren for her fight against the financial industry, her fight for consumer protection, the policy positions that she has taken on in her campaign that I continue to believe are legitimate and sincere. I do believe she sincerely believes in Medicare for all. I just don't think she knows how to go about affecting it. And I don't think she knows how to take on a power complex that's a little bit bigger than what she personally has dealt with and succeeded against. And it shows in her rhetoric, where she courts the vote of the professional class. To be fair, it's going to be hard to win those votes, win the Democratic votes from Bernie, but Democratic with a small d. She's not going to be able to out-populist Bernie, so she's going after her market share of progressive voters. That's totally fine. And I am not going to fault her for trying to win an election. And anyone who does, because she's attacking our Lord and Savior Bernie, is a sucker. I don't support Bernie Sanders because he's a good person, or because he's a sweet guy, or because he's my grandpa or my dad. I don't support him because he says funny things from now and then, from time to time. His honesty and sincerity are bonuses, but they are not why he is the best candidate. Well, they're part of why he's the best candidate, but not because honesty and sincerity are what you need in a politician at all costs. Everything about Bernie Sanders' candidate profile is oriented toward gaining power in the only way that a progressive can in this environment. The only way that you can gain power against a plutocratic establishment is with people power. That's it. That's why his honesty is important. That's why it's important that he's perceived as honest. That's why it's important that he tells the truth, because he has Trump's populist appeal as somebody who's genuine, but he doesn't use it to lie through his teeth. That's why Bernie's the best candidate. Because he harnesses power in the only place that we really genuinely have access to it, unfettered access, is through the people. Money will always protect itself. You cannot take on plutocracy by taking money from oligarchs. They will use it to control you. And Warren has learned this, and she has since changed her funding mechanisms, and that's great. But her messaging still doesn't appeal to the base that she needs to motivate, knowing that she doesn't take corporate money. The upper middle class doesn't know how to campaign. I didn't learn how to actually take part in activism for a politician until I joined this movement. I made a post about this, about how proud I was the first time that I voted for a presidential candidate, and I was like, wow, I've done my civic duty, and I've done my job. I went to the ballot box and I cast a vote. I was 1/30,000,000th of the reason that Hillary Clinton won the Democratic primary. I was really proud of that. 1/30,000,000th. It's more than zero. You should vote. Always vote, always vote, always vote. Not voting accomplishes nothing. But voting is the least effective thing that you can do. You have to do it, but it's the least of things you can do. If I go into the ballot box and I vote for Bernie Sanders, that's one vote. If I make 70 to 75 calls over the course of 2 hours, and I convince 2 people to vote for Bernie Sanders, that is already double the impact of me going into a ballot box. And it took me 3 hours to go vote. It takes me 2 hours to get 2 or 3, maybe 5, maybe 10 other people to vote for Bernie. I've already multiplied the impact. Get involved. Make calls. Phone bank. Canvass. This is how you get a person elected. This is the movement. This is the ground game that got Bernie Sanders a blowout win in Nevada. This is how he won the popular vote in Iowa. This is how he has won the popular vote in every primary contest so far. It's why we're going to gain delegates in South Carolina and why Super Tuesday is going to be an absolute blowout. Because we do not stop canvassing. We don't stop mapping. We don't stop making calls. Our ground game, ground game, ground game. People are your number one resource. Even Bloomberg understands that. That's why he cuts a $2,500 check to anyone willing to shill out for him on Twitter. Warren doesn't get that. That's the truth. Warren is used to being the person. She's got a plan. She's with us. She's used to being the person in charge. She's a technocrat. And a damn good one. There's no such thing as effective enough to take on all of Washington. You can get a CEO fired. You can get a regulation passed. You can change these little things here and there, and those are positive changes from somebody who wants a positive end goal. And that's good, but you need to think bigger if you're going to take on all of Washington. And yes, we're taking on a huge amount of power. And she does not have the critique needed to actually succeed, and it shows in her campaign. And she doesn't understand why Trump won. If she understood why Trump won, she would not have touched a DNA test with a 10-foot pole. She would not have tried to roll out a Medicare for All payment plan. She's trying to prove that she has a plan. She's trying to prove that she's qualified. You don't have to prove that you're qualified. You're Elizabeth fucking Warren. I don't remember the name of the of every CEO that she's gotten fired or press charges against, but you don't have to. She is the champion of the common consumer. Don't waste narrative space. Don't waste press space justifying it. It's a monumental error. And it's the biggest one her campaign has made. Bigger even than the stupid-ass DNA test that rolled out her campaign. Don't roll out a Medicare for All payment plan. You've got a plan for that. Let us trust in that. Talk about issues. Talk about what your qualified ass is going to fight for. And I know it's going to fight for it. And talk about how you're going to gain the power required to support you in that. Talk about down-ballot elections. Endorse viable progressive challenges. You don't have to endorse every single Justice Democrat the way that I do. Or the way that Bernie tends to. And even Bernie didn't endorse Cynthia Nixon. He remained neutral in the New York primary. Bernie doesn't endorse every single progressive, but he sets the message. And then he lets the movement fight on its own behalf. Justice Democrats didn't need a Bernie endorsement on every single one of their candidates. His rhetoric fueled that power, and it continues to fuel that power. It fuels Morgan Harper's run in Ohio against a very, very safe Democratic seat that has done very little to advance a progressive agenda. If you want to donate to Morgan Harper's campaign without any potential of hurting the Democratic Party, go support her campaign. Morgan Harper, Franklin County, Ohio. Shahid Buttar, who's going after Nancy Pelosi in a win-win-win-win scenario. There's no bad outcome. We don't lose a Democratic seat in that district. We get rid of Nancy Pelosi, who I believe that she has been good for the Democratic Party in the past. But, not recently. She capitulates to Trump regularly. She has continued to shit on a progressive agenda, despite the fact that the left is moving left, that the Democrats are moving left, and the country is becoming more populist as well, which means that we can sell them on things like Medicare for All. On a worker-protecting Green New Deal. Bernie understands the effect of his rhetoric. He understands the effect of his ground game. He understands the effect of his organizing and mobilizing his voter base. That they go on to win and primary and take over other aspects of the national legislature. That's how you gain power in America. And she doesn't have a plan for that. So yes, my priority right now is to beat Warren in Massachusetts so that she drops out of the presidential race and continues fighting for a progressive agenda in the Senate. I still support Warren as a politician, but her attacks on Bernie her willingness to undermine the progressive movement in order to get elected, these are not things that I'm a fan of. I'm a fan of her as an agent for change. And right now, she is hurting that change. The DNA test demonstrates how she doesn't realize how Trump won. We're going to talk about that in the next segment, in the second segment after next. She doesn't need to justify her qualifications. You take them for granted. Talk about issues. Mobilize, ground game. And I guarantee that if she had run that campaign from the get-go, she would have taken more voters from Bernie than she thought she could. I might have been one of them. I could very well be voting for her instead of Sanders. I like her more than Sanders. But Sanders knows how to win. And I don't think she knows. And now she's talking about, like, let the convention work out its will. She continues to alienate the progressive base. Every Bernie voter that, if she were to win the nomination, that would not come out and vote for her, I think that her campaign has been very badly mismanaged, possibly even sabotaged by centrist elements. I think that there are people in her campaign who would like her to win, but they would rather Bernie lose and she lose as well than improve her chances of winning while helping Bernie. They would rather she lose in order to beat Bernie. And the only value of Elizabeth Warren to whoever this part of her coalition is, the only value of Elizabeth Warren to her centrist coalition is to create a reasoned alternative to Bernie Sanders. And I think it shows in the way that she's campaigned. So as long as she demonstrates a threat to progressive politics by running for president, I'm going to oppose her. I do not support her for president. If by some random miracle, or even by literally playing the dirtiest superdelegate game at the convention, she manages to get nominated, I will vote for her, and I will advocate voting for her because, outcome-wise, consequentially, it's the greatest good. And she's a better choice in a vacuum. And at the end of the day, if you're voting for or against somebody to punish them for doing something to someone you like, oh, she cheated Bernie. I don't give a fuck. I'm here to gain power. She's a threat to that right now, so I'm going to vote against her. If she's the nominee in November, it's the second best choice still. None of that changes. She's a snake. She betrayed Bernie. Shut the fuck up. We have to get Bernie elected. Bernie can win. I don't think Warren knows how to win. Like none of these are contradictory statements. We have a responsibility to make sure that the nominee, in most cases, that the Democratic nominee wins. If it's Warren, that's a better case scenario than if it's Biden or Buttigieg or Klobuchar, especially if it's Bloomberg. And yes, if she gains the nomination in a situation where Bernie goes in with a plurality of delegates, it'll be disgusting, it'll be really, really frustrating, it'll be extremely anti-democratic, and it'll show that she is not as demonstrated progressive politics as she claims to be. All of that is true, while we can still say it's better if she gets nominated than anyone else but Bernie. That's probably going to be a segment on its own. And then this will be part 2, which is politically, she's the wrong choice. Bernie's the right choice. And we're going to talk more about that later. Ideologically, however, she's also the wrong choice. And we're just going to watch a couple of clips really showing the ideological differences. In a previous segment, we covered the differences between their statements on India. For the sake of the VOD cutting, I'm going to repeat their statements. So Bernie's statement on India was, over 200 million Muslims call India home. Widespread anti-Muslim mob violence has killed at least 27 and injured many more. Trump responds by saying, that's up to India. This is a failure of leadership on human rights. Elizabeth Warren responded with, it's important to strengthen relationships with democratic partners like India. India, by the way, a country that is being ruled by a fascist party and is actively killing Muslims right now. But we must be able to speak truthfully about our values, including religious freedom and freedom of expression. And violence against peaceful protesters is never acceptable. She's left room for interpretation that the peaceful protesters are either Muslims or they're Hindus. They're Muslims. Yes, there is always retaliatory violence against innocent people. Yes, Muslims beating up Hindus is not good. Yes, it has happened in the past. It happened in Bombay, where there was actual violence perpetrated by Muslims against Hindus. That was bad. Still, most of it was Hindus versus Muslims. It started with the demolition of a Muslim mosque. A mosque in Ayodhya. Based on crazy historical claims. Babri Masjid demolition was the equivalent of settlements in West Bank. Basically saying, but God wants us to have this land. It doesn't matter that you've owned this land for centuries or millennia. Or decades. Whatever. Doesn't matter. God wants us to have this land, so we're going to destroy all of your shit and build our shit on top of it. That temple, by the way, being built now. It's been approved by the Supreme Court. Let the statute of limitations run out on the terrorist attack that actually demolished the mosque. Approved it. Warren does not want to alienate her fascist audience or her fascist supporting audience. Sanders doesn't care. This is what we believe. If you agree with us or you're willing to agree with us, there is room for you in this tent. If you do not believe in justice, you are not welcome here. That's it. Coincidentally, that is the one movement that can beat fascism, because that's the one movement that is not corruptible by it. We're going to talk a couple more foreign policy clips from the debate. So Bernie and Warren were asked, basically, what are you going to do about Israel? Israel is, the Israel-Palestine conflict is characterized by an extremely fascistic president in Prime Minister in Bibi Netanyahu, who is right-wing, authoritarian, corrupt, and kind of oscillates between effective fascism and clown fascism, right? Big friend of Trump, comes off looking ridiculous, has the Trump side of corruption, but also like very great at manipulating the views of diaspora. So Bernie and Elizabeth Warren were both asked, are you going to move the embassy back to Tel Aviv? And generally, what are you going to do about the Israel-Palestine conflict? And these were their answers. We're going to start with Bernie.
Let me just, the answer is it's something that we would take into consideration.
Which would,
but here, excuse me, but here is the point. I am very proud of being Jewish. I actually lived in Israel for some months. But what I happen to believe is that right now, sadly, tragically, in Israel, through Bibi Netanyahu, you have a reactionary racist who is now running that country. And I happen to believe that what our foreign policy in the Mideast should be about is absolutely protecting the independence and security of Israel. But you cannot ignore the suffering of the Palestinian people. We have got to have a policy that reaches out to the Palestinians and the Americans. And in answer to your question, that will come within the context of bringing nations together in the
All right. So what did Bernie say? I support Israel. I lived in Israel. I'm proud of my Jewish heritage. Netanyahu's a racist. Netanyahu's a racist, just like BJP are fascists. You see this? Like, there's moral clarity And I know that term is tossed around a lot because it's such a novel concept in American politics. Bibi Netanyahu's a racist. He's a reactionary. He revels in the deaths of innocent Palestinians. This is not up for debate. When you regularly launch incursions that kill Palestinian children, innocent Palestinians, in the quadruple digits, in response to ineffective rocket firings that, at worst, every now and then cause a few casualties here and there. And I am not trying to handwash that Israeli citizens should not have to live under fear of rocket fire. Yes, one innocent life is terrible. One innocent death is terrible. What about 1,300? There are elements in the Palestinian government that should be held accountable for aiding and abetting terrorism. There are elements of Hamas, obviously of Hamas, which is a largely militant organization, that need to be held to account, and they need to be defeated. Extremist elements of any political faction that is historically power deprived. Extremism subsides when diplomacy resumes. This has happened in Iran. It happened with the PLO. It has happened throughout history. The more we negotiate, the more power we give to the power deprived, the more responsible they are with it. Rocket fire is not okay. It's a measure of desperation, though. The question is, how do you stop it? You stop it by holding the power brokers accountable. The power broker here is Bibi. And Bibi is a neo-fascist. He is an evil person. And he has to be removed. And democratic elements, reformist elements, and liberal elements in Israeli politics need to be empowered. That's a change that ultimately has to happen from within. But the U.S. has a massive power, has a massive amount of power over Israel. And we need to leverage that power to say, listen, if you're going to ban our Palestinian members or people who are critical of you from being part of our delegations there, you should have the courtesy to turn down our aid. If you're not going to respect the human rights of these people that you have so much power over, you should probably turn down our aid. Or we should stop giving it to you. Republican politicians say that Israel is our most important ally in the Middle East. We are their most important ally in the world. And protecting them is important. Just as important is protecting the people that they have power over. Just as important. Bernie understands that, and he does not equivocate on it. Here's Elizabeth Warren's response.
Sorry.
Same question. What would you do to stop the mass murder in Idlib, Syria?
Look, I think that what we've got to do is we have to provide humanitarian relief. We need to work with our allies on this, but this is not a moment for military intervention. We have got to use our military only when we see a military problem that can be solved militarily. We cannot send our military in unless we have a plan to get them out.
Sorry, that was the wrong video. Give me 1 second.
Same question. What would you do to stop the mass murder in Idlib, Syria?
Well, I'm just gonna summarize what she said. I queued up the wrong video, but basically what she said was, "Will you move the embassy back?" And she said, "That's not ours to do." She said, "We need to get Israelis and Palestinians to the negotiating table and let them work it out." Very reflective of Trump's "it's up to India" response. Very reflective of Trump's "it's up to India" response. She said, we need to get Israel and Palestine to the table and they negotiate it. And a two-state solution. I'm not going to comment on whether a two-state solution is the right or wrong way to go. And there's a lot of debate even within left circles about what the solution for the Israel-Palestine conflict is, and I don't feel comfortable inserting my opinion into that. And I'm going to defer to more knowledgeable people than myself. I've heard very compelling arguments that actually a two-state solution is not viable, that there needs to be a bigger democratization, which largely involves the ending of global capitalism. So unfortunately, some people believe that unless we globally end capitalism and start to build toward a stateless global socialist society, that we're just not going to solve these conflicts. And they may be right. If that's the case, then I think we're all pretty screwed, as somebody who doesn't believe that capitalism is getting overthrown anytime soon. But when Warren says it is not ours to do, to move the embassy back to Tel Aviv, as if America doesn't have, that America doesn't have the power to exert diplomatic pressure where it sees fit, and B, as if Israel and Palestine at the negotiating table are equal actors with equal power. That is not true. It is our responsibility as global mediators of conflict to make sure that people with imbalances of power are corrected for. People with disproportionate amounts of power in negotiations are held to account. That is our job. We're I don't want to overplay a very cliche trope, which is that Israel and Palestine are like our children in America. It's very paternalistic. But in a sense, in terms of power, that's kind of the sick case. As far as the power held, we've got a sibling abusing a sibling with less power. And in terms of power, we have the equivalent of a parent. We are a global superpower. We are capable of putting a lot of pressure on people. And we're not doing it. And for Elizabeth Warren to say, I'm staying out of it, while the big kid beats the shit out of the little kid, that's between them. I got them to the negotiating table. That is disgusting. I'm sorry. I love Elizabeth Warren on her domestic policy record, but holy shit, is her foreign policy rhetoric just god-awful. It's disqualifying. We're going to watch this other video, and it's just going to really hit the nail on the head of where Elizabeth Warren stands on foreign policy and why she is not a good candidate for president given the option that we have. That is more viable to be elected, that is more viable to take on Trump, that is more viable to actually enact and gain power for the working class in America, and just has a better concept of what political ethics look like, political humanity, global solidarity, cosmopolitanism. These are all words that Bernie Sanders understands that Warren does not. Because she has a one-track mind for consumer protection and whatever little reforms that she can enact here, there, which are significant when you consider that she's one person. But once she becomes an institution running a country, it's not good enough to get a Wells Fargo CEO fired. You've got to be able to affect multiple pictures at the same time. So this is a video of Elizabeth Warren asking if we should intervene in Syria.
Sorry.
Same question. What would you do to stop the mass murder in Idlib, Syria?
Look, I think that what we've got to do is we have to provide humanitarian relief. We need to work with our allies on this, but this is not a moment for military intervention. We have got to use our military only when we see a military problem that can be solved militarily. We cannot send our military in unless we have a plan to get them out.
So there, it's not a bad response, but it shows a world of difference between the standard democratic answer on military intervention versus a properly progressive statement of global solidarity. What did she say about military intervention? The problem with it is that we go in without an exit strategy. It's a very one-track concern for the lives of our troops. And yes, the lives of our troops matters. Of course they matter. But so do the lives of the innocent citizens that we bomb the shit out of with drones. You don't need an exit strategy for drone warfare. When she says we should use the military only for military problems that can be solved militarily, contrast that with Bernie's rhetoric that the military should only be used as a last resort. Last resort. You've got a Venn diagram. Take one circle. Problems that can only be solved through diplomacy. Another circle. Problems that can only be solved with the military. And they intersect. There are problems that can be solved in both manners. What do you use for that section in the middle? Bernie says diplomacy. Warren leaves the options open. Last resort rhetoric is the only progressive rhetoric. This is exactly the rhetoric that Obama used when running for president. He said, I was against the war in Iraq. I voted against it. Oh, wait, he didn't vote against it because he wasn't a senator at the time. But I opposed the war in Iraq from the beginning while Hillary was voting for it. He didn't have a voting record to run on, so who knows how he would have decided. Very easy to campaign against it, but let's take him at his word. Just because you oppose military intervention doesn't mean you're not going to become a president who expands the drone warfare program, who bombs the crap out of the Middle East. Just only when you know that it's not going to actually actively risk American soldiers. So no, it's not good enough. It's not good enough to say we need to protect our troops from dying, and we need to make sure that we don't use the military to solve problems that the military can't solve. War is a last resort. War is a fucking atrocity. And the only time it should be used is if there's a bigger atrocity that can only be stopped through force. I'm talking literal Nazis. Nazi imperialism. When you say we should only use the military for problems that we can solve with the military, you are leaving options open. That is a relevant difference. And she said nothing for respecting the lives of people who would be put at risk by military intervention and by drone warfare. And she never has. She has an A+ voting record on Trump's defense budgets. As an A+ for Trump. She is not a progressive on foreign policy. I'm sorry. She's not. And I will continue to stand for her. I will stand her like nobody's business on her consumer protection record. And even on a sincerity of her fight for the working class. I railed against the primary Warren hashtag earlier today. I saw it on Twitter. I was like, it's the dumbest shit ever. She's under threat from the center in Massachusetts. We have to protect her seat. She's got a dynastic corporate, like, feckless Kennedys. This is like the Gandhi family in India. The Nehru's line of, like, political dynasty. Very, very, like, just not at all qualified people. Gunning for Warren's seat. No, I'm not here to primary her out of a Senate seat. If she gets primaried, it's going to be by a corporate Democrat like Joe Kennedy. Or whatever milquetoast name he has. I'm not interested in that. But I'm also not interested in electing a president who does not have a basic respect for the lives of people beyond our border. And if you don't believe in protecting the lives of humans beyond our border from the very policies that we created, and I point you to the moral clarity in Bernie's message when he talked about U.S. affecting coups that overthrow democratic governments abroad. In response to questions about his support for democracy, when he said that the Cuban government did one thing correctly which was completely unrelated to the authoritarian elements that he absolutely denounced and the authoritarian type that he denounced. And he said, if you want to see my record on whether I support dictatorships, look at my record on what the U.S., look at what I say on how the U.S. interferes in democratic regimes abroad. That is somebody who respects human life. That doesn't necessarily have to have an eagle on the passport. That's important. It's important. What do you know? Another long episode. We're going to take a break, and we're going to talk about a little bit about the DNC and how the DNC is trying to deprive Bernie of the nomination, and a little bit more. All right. And we're back. That was a quick break. All right, we're just going to cover the DNC real quick. Do a little commentary. So basically, reports, as expected, various members of the Democratic establishment are already trying to figure out how to deny Bernie the nomination. This is all very expected, very anti-democratic, very disgusting. Basically, elements within the Democratic Party are saying, we will do whatever we have to. If Bernie goes in with a plurality, we're going to do whatever we have to deny him the nomination. And then there are people saying that, if he goes in with a bare plurality, we're going to deny him the nomination. And then there's people basically saying, if he goes in with the majority of votes, like there are some Democrats who don't like Bernie, but they said if he goes in with the plurality of votes, he should be nominated. If he doesn't get nominated with the plurality, it's going to do lasting damage to the Democratic Party. And they're absolutely right. So we're going to do a quick take on this. Super quick take. There have been criticisms of Elizabeth Warren, who has basically come out and said, despite the fact that in 2015, 2016, 2017, she said, I'm a superdelegate. I'm against superdelegates. I don't think superdelegates should decide elections. In 2017, she said, I think Bernie got cheated out of the nomination because when superdelegates had their votes counted before a single primary vote was cast, it looked like Hillary Clinton was already winning. And the optics effect of that basically caused anybody on the fence to fall into Hillary's camp in the interest of uniting behind the consensus candidate. Those were all true. And she's turned around on all of them since her last statement on the matter in 2018, where she said the person with the most votes should be elected. But now that it benefits her, she's saying, I'm going to let the convention work its will. Because she is trying to see a path, maybe not to the nomination, but to choosing somebody who will give her a position of power. And I genuinely think that she doesn't believe in a Bernie presidency. And I think that she is making a calculated risk, or a calculated decision, that she can do more good by denying Bernie the nomination and putting herself in position in a future administration. She's completely wrong. And she doesn't understand why Trump won. Like, this is the point where if I did not have a baseline, like, archetypal respect for Elizabeth Warren, I would be calling her DNA test Liz over and over and over again. Because that was the fundamental miscalculation that shows that she does not know how to beat Trump. Medicare for all rollout. Ridiculous. Too clever by half. Attacks on Bernie, trying to paint him as sexist. She is burning down the only tent that reliably supports her in order to win an election. And the main defense is, well, Bernie did the same thing in 2016. He was lobbying superdelegates to vote for him instead so that he could overturn Hillary Clinton's majority of pledged delegates. Yeah, he did. I was against that too. But I'm not going to sit here and pretend like it's the same thing. Bernie entered into an election where superdelegates had pledged support to a candidate who had not yet been voted for by a single voter. It was January 2016, and Hillary had a massive, nearly insurmountable superdelegate lead. And that painted every single primary contest. Every person who was on the fence was like, well, Clinton's winning, so I'm going to vote for her. I think we need to fortify the Democratic candidate. Who knows how those primaries would have gone if Clinton had not gone into it with the backing of the Democratic machine? I imagine at least a little differently. And Bernie looked at that very anti-democratic feature of the system and said, you know what? I'm going to try and harness that into my favor and say, listen, I think you guys should support me instead. It didn't last very long, and he wound up really just harnessing it as a negotiating tool in order to move Hillary a little bit to the left so that he would endorse her. And again, that's about harnessing power, trying to figure out a way to get your Democratic agenda into the mainstream. And that led to changes in the DNC. Minor changes. He wanted to get rid of superdelegates altogether. Instead, they said, okay, we're just going to have superdelegates in the second round. Fine. If he had used superdelegates to get the nomination, I would have been against that. Granted, I voted for Hillary in 2016, so it would have been very easy, but I like to think that even today, I would be against that. If Bernie goes in to the Democratic Convention without a plurality of delegates, or at least within a very, very slim margin, and I will hold that for any candidate. If he goes in without close to a plurality, I will not support overturning the popular vote to make him the nominee. I will advocate for nominating whoever has the plurality of delegates. As long as that plurality is significant. At least 5%, let's say. 5% plus. And over, let's say, over 28 to 30% of delegates, right? And also 5% ahead of whoever's second. And that's significant. That's a significant lead, and whoever holds that lead should be the nominee. It's probably going to be Bernie, and you might read this and say, well, it's easy for you to say now that Bernie's leading and that it's very likely he's going to be that person. But that's the best I can do. And for what it's worth, I would have been against Bernie overturning the popular vote in order to gain the nomination, even believing, as I do now, that he's the best candidate and that he was the best candidate in 2016. I would have been against it because I don't think that the way to protect democracy is to completely subvert it altogether. Yes, you play within systems that have been perverted and destroyed, but you don't propagate and feed into and escalate their destruction. You don't make the subversion of democracy worse in order to fix the problem. Playing within the system, that's one thing. Which is also why I wouldn't really necessarily have a problem if Bernie was like, I am not going to make a big deal about people funneling money into random dark money super PACs. He can come out and denounce them if he wants. He can say, I don't accept their support, knowing that he has no power. But as long as he does not ever cater to them, solicit their support, show that he approves of them. But that's me, right? And that fails a purity test. And it's an important purity test. And maybe it's better to pass that purity test than to accept that money. Maybe it's better to show your purity and come out stronger. And that's part of the debate on Jeff Weaver, right? Jeff Weaver was saying, like, will you accept Bloomberg's support if you're the nominee? And Jeff Weaver basically said no. Which I don't know if that was a smart move. But who knows? Maybe it'll play out. And that principle translates to a lot of democratic power that Bernie has. So, yes, I disagreed with Bernie doing what Warren supporters claim was the same thing, was not the same thing. I disagreed with him doing it in 2016. but it's not the same thing. So I'm going to move in. It's not the same thing. He was trying to gain power in an anti-democratic system so that he could enforce democratic reforms. What he was not doing was subverting existing democracy within the system, which is what would be happening, especially when you consider the power imbalance. He is representing the disenfranchised, representing the suppressed. He's representing the people who have been suppressed by the systems that exist. And he still is. If the forces that have power and are at risk of losing some of it take action, anti-democratic action, to keep that power and suppress the people who are making their voices heard, it will do disastrous damage to the Democratic Party. It will absolutely hand Trump the election. If Bernie is more than 5 points ahead and somebody else is nominated, there is nothing anyone can do to fix the turnout that is going to wipe out that person in the Electoral College. That applies the same. If Biden mounts like a miracle comeback, if his win in South Carolina today like gets him like the momentum he needs to gain delegates on Super Tuesday and come back into this. Let's say he goes into the convention with a 5-point plurality. Bernie's right behind him, but everyone's like, you know what? Biden's too much of a loose cannon. He's too much of a renegade, too much of a maverick. We're gonna go with Bernie. Or just enough, right? The Warren people, the anti-Biden people, they rally behind Bernie to support him against Biden, to defeat Biden. Every centrist in the party is going to be furious. Going to be absolutely furious. And there's a good chance the Democratic establishment will deny help to Bernie in winning the election. And they are going to. Even if Bernie wins, there's going to be a certain level of ambivalence on the part of the Democratic Party. How much ambivalence is going to determine whether he has a shot to win the election? And if we piss off the establishment by subverting a consensus candidate like Biden, it's probably going to wipe out even Bernie's chances of beating Trump. So I'm going to say as a bedrock rule, if any candidate is 5+ points ahead, that candidate needs to be the nominee. Otherwise, Trump wins. With that said, if Bernie goes in with a plurality and he doesn't get nominated, I'm talking 5+ point plurality, outside of the margin of error, significant portion of the popular vote, we're talking like at least 35%, probably, depending on the distribution. But if he goes in with 5% more votes than the second place person and doesn't get nominated, I am not going to openly, vocally support the nominee. That is the breaking point for me. I just won't do it. Because I don't think it's worth it. I don't think that my efforts will do anything. I don't think we can beat Trump. I will cast a vote that does as much as I realistically can to defeat Donald Trump, and secondarily do the most good I can. In New York, my power is limited. I could vote for Jill Stein. I could vote for Michael Bloomberg. I could vote for, like, friggin' anyone, right? There's not much I can do. And if someone comes to me and asks me, Shashank, whom should I vote for? I live in Ohio. Whom should I vote for? I will tell you, you need to vote to beat Trump. You do. But I will not sit here and tell you that you need to I'm not going to tell somebody whose voice was actively suppressed by the Democratic Party that claims to represent them. I'm not going to tell them to reward that suppression. I will always tell you that you need to vote to remove Trump, because we do. There are people who are more vulnerable who are relying on us to protect them. On immigrant rights, on women's rights, on LGBTQ rights, to keep children out of concentration camps, to keep the government out of women's bodies, which, by the way, Bloomberg, I don't know that he's going to do that. In fact, I don't think he is. Bloomberg does not have an anti-authoritarian streak. This is not somebody who thinks that people should be left alone. If there's a legitimate nominee who either goes in to the convention with a plurality of votes or goes into a convention within a percentage point or two of Bernie Sanders, and they gain the brokering power needed in order to defeat Bernie. I'm talking a couple percentage points, you know? If that candidate comes out as the nominee, I will advocate for voting for them. And unless it's Bloomberg, and only Bloomberg, with the exception of only Bloomberg, if it's Biden, Klobuchar, Buttigieg, obviously Warren, it doesn't matter what she's pulled in this primary. If it's any of those people, I will come out here and I will tailor that rhetoric to anybody who asks me, no matter who. Whether it's a woman, whether it's a member of the queer community, of the working class queer community, who says, I feel very disenfranchised. Because Bernie had a plurality. I feel like my vote doesn't matter. I did the labor. I took the responsibility to coalesce behind my candidate. They didn't. I will tell them, yes, they didn't. But our plurality was not big enough. It was within question. It was within the margin of error. There is a shred of legitimacy to this person's candidacy, and we need to respect that. And you need to vote to protect the rights of the most vulnerable among us. If it's Bloomberg, I can't do that. If it's Bloomberg, I can't tell an African American who's directly or indirectly affected by stop and frisk, or a woman who was subjected to sexual harassment, the likes of which that he has shown, who's been called a fat broad or a horse-faced lesbian or some analog for it. I can't tell that person to swallow their humanity and vote for Michael Bloomberg. And if they ask me, what should I do? I will say we need to beat Donald Trump. And you should do whatever you feel capable of doing to help make that happen. But I can't obligate that person to flare up their trauma like that. I can't do it. I cannot tell an individual to vote for Michael Bloomberg. Someone like me, sure. A privileged ass, like, white or like non-black, non-Latino kid, non-Muslim kid, sure. A man, a cis man, someone who hasn't been treated with absolute disdain by Bloomberg in his rhetoric, like the trans community. So yes, white, cis, non-working class men. Bloomberg's the nominee, you vote for him to beat Trump. Easiest thing I've ever said. That applies to me too. But if you're part of the many communities that have been affected by this person's disgusting right-wing brand of authoritarianism, I cannot in good conscience obligate you to vote for that person. And I will simply say, do whatever you are personally capable of doing to beat Trump. If that means voting for someone you loathe, someone who dehumanizes you, if that's possible for you, do it. If not, I'm not going to judge you for it. That's a line that I can't cross. Not with another person. And it's going to be the same situation if 40% of the populace, of the Democratic electorate, largely consisting of disenfranchised voters, people who have been dropped from voter rolls, whose interests have been routinely ignored by the Democratic Party in the interest of working with the Republicans. People who have experienced bankruptcies or who are at risk of it, people with debt. people who work 60 hours a week and still can't make ends meet because of poverty wages and rising prices of living, rising rents, and housing crises. If these people send Bernie Sanders to the convention with more votes than any other candidate by a wide margin, and he does not come out as the nominee because the establishment decided, hey, we're going to subvert democracy, I cannot tell those disenfranchised people to reward that. To continue to feed into the system that continues to tell them that they are worth nothing. I can't do it. And once again, I will say, do whatever you feel you can to defeat Trump. If that means voting for the nominee for a party that has treated you like garbage, great. Fine, do it. And we'll supplement it with a comprehensive and robust agenda of primarying the fuck out of Democrats. If that drives you to the polls, great. If that drives you to help beat Trump, protect our family and friends in the immigrant community, in the queer community, the trans community, the community of people who aren't cis men, cis straight men. Great. And I will try and solicit votes to beat Trump by saying, like, there is a community that fights for you. And we're the same people encouraging you to vote tactically are the people who will continue to fight for you, will continue to organize. I was such a big anti-Bernie or buster in 2016, and I stand by that. But the DNC is at risk of crossing a line that cannot be come back from. Now, the last thing I want to mention is there is legitimacy to saying that a plurality shouldn't be enough to declare a candidate, to declare a nominee. I absolutely agree. The solution is not to throw democracy out the window. A decent plurality is it's a suboptimal equilibrium. It is not the best option. The best option is national ranked choice voting. In every single state, people rank every single candidate on the ballot by which choice they have, which choice it is. And I'll say, I vote for Bernie Sanders. My second choice is Warren. My third choice is Klobuchar. Fourth choice, Biden. Fifth choice, Buttigieg. Bloomberg, omitted. To quote centrists, I only vote for Democrats. When I rank those choices, the candidate with the most votes still gets those delegates. And candidates get delegates based on how many first rank votes they get. But my vote gets recorded and computed. And we have the technology to do this. So you get to the convention and nobody has a majority. You start eliminating candidates by viability. Just like with a caucus, but without the coin flips, without the brokering, without the deal making. Just say, hey, Amy Klobuchar, you don't have X number of percentage points. And it can be a function of what the distribution is, right? You don't have enough percentage points in support. You're cut. And everyone who voted for Klobuchar across the country will have their vote reassigned to their second choice. And then you look at that. Do you have a majority? No. Cut the next option. Reassign the votes. Do you have a majority? No. Cut. Reassign the next option. And you do that until you have a majority. I'm sure there are problems with this system, but if you want a democratic system, that needs a majority of votes, this is the way to do it. This is the only way to do it. Maybe not the only way, but it's the best way. I am open to arguments. I think that's the best way. I'm open to arguments otherwise. But I think national ranked choice voting, if you really want to solve the plurality problem, the tragedy of the tyranny of the plurality, let's call it, then that's the solution. Until then, you go with the most democratic form of the system we have now, which is ultimately the nominee has to be decided by the people. And if the coalition trying to beat the person in front cannot get its shit together to throw its support behind a single candidate during the time that people are still voting, then you don't get to go after people have voted and start brokering anti-democratic deals. People say Bernie shouldn't get rewarded with the nomination if he doesn't have the appeal to gain a majority of votes. That's bullshit. That is bullshit. The Democratic establishment should not be rewarded for being too feckless to center its entire support behind a single candidate. They don't know. They don't, like, the Democratic establishment is in fractures. It's in tatters. Some of them are saying, no, we have to unionize behind Bernie. Some of them are saying we have to beat Bernie at X cost, but we shouldn't beat Bernie at this cost. Some of them are saying we have to beat Bernie no matter what, even if it loses us the election to Trump. Some of them are saying, let Bernie get nominated and let him lose to Trump. The establishment doesn't know what to do, doesn't know whom to support. They're in complete shambles right now. And the current superdelegate rules reward that level of complete incompetence. If you are not competent enough to defeat Bernie Sanders before you get to the convention, to have a single candidate beat him in votes, to just say, you know what? Okay, New York Times, you endorse Klobuchar and Warren. We don't like Warren so much, we're going to endorse Klobuchar. Biden says, great, I'm on Team Klobuchar. Buttigieg says, great, I'm on Team Klobuchar. Bloomberg says, you know what? I'm going to throw my immense amounts of money behind Amy Klobuchar. You want a democratic way to defeat a populist candidate? That's how you do it. That is the only legitimate way to beat Bernie Sanders. And they can still do that. And I welcome them to do that. I challenge them to fucking do that. And then we get to see exactly how much of your support base actually cares about beating Bernie. Because I guarantee it's not as much as you think it is. The reason Biden won't drop out and endorse someone else is that he knows that a really decent portion would not follow him, that they go to Bernie Sanders. If Biden drops out of the race, there's a good chance Bernie Sanders goes into the convention with a majority. Because he has the momentum. So Biden faces a catch-22, right? He's hurting the center by staying in the race because he can't win. But if he drops out, Bernie wins. So go ahead. Pick a candidate. Coalesce behind them. Manufacture consent for them. Get MSNBC on the job, though it looks like you're kind of losing them. Get CNN on the job, though it looks like you're kind of losing them. You're losing the media, too, because they can't ignore how incompetent you are. Don't rely on a convention, on a brokered convention system that rewards you for being as feckless as you are right now. You don't have the gumption to stand behind a single candidate and try and get people to vote for them. Pick it. I recommend Klobuchar. Biden can't win the nomination. Klobuchar can't win the election, but she has the best chance out of anyone who isn't Bernie or Biden. And at this point, we know the establishment won't line up behind Warren to beat Bernie, partly because Warren's kind of run her campaign into the ground. But that would be my ideal scenario. Don't get me wrong, I still resent and would resent Warren even more, but I would rather Warren be the person to... Because at the end of the day, I'd rather have Warren in the White House than Biden. So that's that. If you want a majority of delegates, pick a candidate and support them. And I challenge you to win a majority. I challenge you to beat Bernie going into the convention. Otherwise, line up or get the fuck out of the way. We'll be right back. I'm going to read a statement that I wrote and talk a little bit about it. It's about electability, and I think it's relevant, so I'll be right back. And we're back. I meant to do this right after the State of the Union, which was when I wrote this statement as a social media post. I'm sorry for the light behind me. It's just bad lighting. I usually do this show at night, and I don't have curtains. Just take it as, like, holy imagery or something. So I prepared... I basically wrote out a statement on my social media page about... what was clear to me after watching the State of the Union, and it's just as relevant now, even more relevant now. And this was around the time that Bernie Sanders was really starting to form a front-runner persona and a front-runner profile. So, yeah, I'm just going to read it out. I'm probably going to make, like, commentaries in the middle, interrupting it, but here it is. Trump's State of the Union was really, 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 really good. Horrifyingly good. It was hands down the best State of the Union address any president vying for re-election in this context could possibly have given. It's long past time for us to take this person seriously and understand what he defeated to get here. Bear in mind that my social media audience generally is like college-educated, very elite, very, very much Warren supporting types. Trump spent an hour lying to and gaslighting working voters into thinking his administration has accomplished what it set out to do. They have taken a single prison reform law and a dangerous level of overemployment as their substantive accomplishments, and filled the rest with lies and pablum in order to convince their swing voters that they do indeed fight for the working class. We are seeing this administration actively transform from Trump's feckless brand of clown fascism to a shrewd, politically effective, BJP-esque, neo-fascist entity that is getting better and better at weaponizing economic angst against minorities with each passing day. We talked about BJP earlier in the show, and Trump visiting Modi is not the beginning of his turn into Modi. His camp, his faction is becoming more effective. Even if he's feckless, his handlers know how to manage him, and that is scary. Trump is hyper-targeting every area that lost Hillary Clinton and the Democratic establishment the 2016 election. Depressed black turnout, TPP and NAFTA, xenophobia, and the swamp. He even touted a half-assed family leave provision that covers a fraction of what Democrats have been after for years. By the way, what Democrats have been after for years, including the family leave provision that was passed by the Trump administration, had been blocked incessantly by plutocratic, sexist, authoritarian Republicans. And he's doing it to convince white women to vote for him again, as they did 3 years ago. You need women of color to win an election as a Democrat. Women of color support Bernie Sanders. Now Trump is gearing up to smear and degrade whomever he runs against, diverting from material issues that, if centered in this election, would have him out on his ass and hopefully, knock on wood, facing federal indictments. It is time to stop fucking around. Whom are you going to nominate to beat this person? Trump has assaults prepared for every one of these candidates. It is what he does. And he has it prepared for every single candidate because nearly every candidate tries to run in part on their character, as if that's what the voters who will decide this election give two shits about. Spoiler alert, it's not. Voters don't care about candidate character. They don't. They don't care about your story about your father being a janitor or being an abusive alcoholic or somebody who turned it around. And I as a human who has the privilege to empathize with random political elite figures rather than worrying about where my next meal is going to come from, I have the privilege to empathize with that person. Your average working voter does not. They don't give a shit. They want to know how you're going to fix their shit. That's your job. That's your job, is to help them make ends meet. That's what they care about. They don't care who your father was. They don't care who your grandpa was. They don't care how much money your great-grandmother had when she moved here from God knows where. I do. I think it's an interesting story. But I'm privileged enough to worry about that shit. And on weeks that I don't know if I have a paycheck coming, I care a lot less about other people's stories. And this is central. Republicans win on empty populist rhetoric, combined with smearing their opponents. They convince you, they know all of the rhetoric to get you on their side, and they supplement it by convincing you that the other person is not. The smear plus the pablum. That's it. In this political climate, Democrats can only win on issues and moral clarity. If we nominate someone who runs on their profile, we are nominating somebody with a gaping vulnerability, because Trump's strongest point as a candidate is the smear. So what's it going to be? Burisma Biden all day. The swamp, nepotism, the swamp. Corrupt Joe. Or abusing Amy getting clobbered, no pun intended, on staffing scandals and her tough on crime record. Remember that time that she sent a child to jail for life on very, very, very shady evidence? And I'm not about purity testing members of any movement based on mistakes they've made in the past. But that's a weak point, because she is running on her character. She talks about her father, she talks about her fight, she talks about who she is as a person. In an almost completely ideology and issues-free way. She doesn't ever talk about actual issues. All she talks about is character. It's open season if she's the nominee. It's open season if Biden's the nominee. And Trump will attack her for her tough on crime record, for her bad record on race. Is that hypocritical? Of course it is. Doesn't matter. Trump will use a single prison reform law to sidestep even the slightest mention of the Central Park Five, or calling Mexicans rapists, or referring to majority African countries as shithole countries. Or worse yet, nominate Pete Buttigieg or Michael Bloomberg, and Trump's job will be done for him. It'll be done on his behalf. Ask any expert what happens to a Democratic candidate with depressed or zero black support. Ask him. Buttigieg and Bloomberg get wiped out. He doesn't even need to smear them. He will. Doesn't need to. In another timeline, Warren will be quite well equipped to synthesize her campaign with the material issues she has spent years fighting for. And, bonus, this week we saw the fighting Warren that we all wanted to see. But that has to be supplemented by a clear understanding of the populism that she needs to win this election, which she doesn't have. And if she could form that synthesis in this timeline, she could even overcome the sexist and racist smears that she would face in a general, and has already faced from Trump. And I'd be proud and enthusiastic as hell to fight for her election, despite the serious moral qualms I have with her foreign policy. But the sad reality is that her campaign to date, in this reality, has been a series of massive political blunders. From the DNA test to the Medicare rollout that was too clever by half for any kind of effective PR, to a failed attempt to siphon voters from her progressive rival. Whoever is running her campaign needs to be fired for either gross incompetence or passive or active sabotage, or both. And at this point, I don't trust her to know how to beat Trump. I get that you want to elect Elizabeth Warren. I want to elect Elizabeth Warren as well. At least a very big part of me does. But you nominate her, it's going to be Pocahontas, Pocahontas, Pocahontas. And if she tries to appeal to Trump's lack of character, it's going to do fuck all for her. It helps against Democrats. It helps against Bloomberg because Democratic voters care about character. Swing voters don't. Right-leaning voters don't. They care about issues. And if Warren had been running an issues campaign, supplemented by her prosecutorial attitude against people that she despises, that she abhors, she could win. But she needs the public on her side, and then to show them why her opponent is a disgusting, racist, misogynist piece of shit. She needs both of those. She doesn't know how to get the public on her side. She doesn't know how to get working class people on her side, despite the fact that she fights for them. That's so frustrating to me. It's so frustrating to me. So in terms of beating Trump, she's not the choice. Pocahontas, every day. Is it disgusting? Yes. Do I hate it? Yes. Do I want to have to strategize around it? No. It is everything that I abhor about politics, but it's also reality you have to deal with. Bernie Sanders is not my favorite politician or someone I have supported. He's not even my favorite politician in the race. He's not someone I've supported for a long time. I was extremely critical of him in 2016 and 2017, and I do not agree with all of his policy proposals. But he has empowered populism against the very hateful forces that try to weaponize it against the marginalized. He understands where the power lies, who is misusing it, and what it will take to dismantle that corruption. And he knows whom he is fighting for, and he makes the fight about them. Do you know why his poll numbers didn't drop every single time someone called him a socialist? Do you know why his poll numbers didn't drop when he got slammed for the Cuba comments? Why his poll numbers didn't drop over the Warren stuff? They kept rising. Because it's not about him. So here, you can't hit him as a socialist or a radical. I'm going to read this out. Because he just says, if I'm radical for believing it is indefensible to have to choose between crushing medical debt and death, then yes, I'm a radical. I wrote that before the Nevada debate, where he said, not verbatim, but he said a very, very close version of this. He said, if I am radical for believing in fighting for and speaking out for those who have been forgotten and left behind for decades, then maybe you need a better definition. That's exactly why he wins. He's a populist, and he's honest. He tells them where the problem really lies. And and I've mentioned this in a previous segment, the policy proposals he has that I disagree with, I don't criticize. And I don't criticize them because it's not about whether or not they get enacted or whether or not they'll be effective. It's about identifying the problem and knowing that you know the problem, and then knowing that you're going to use the resources of the government to where those resources need to be employed. That's the important part. Every statement about him that he makes gets reframed to his social analysis. He dismisses all discussion of labels because the election isn't about him. It's about the people he's fighting for. And to borrow from Michael Brooks' hypothesis, if Trump calls him Crazy Bernie, he'll just reply, "Okay, Mr. Mental Health," and then he'll segue to talking about how psychological care and dental and optical will be covered under Medicare for All, and how deductibles are a moral travesty. These are all true things. He turns the smears into discussions of issues and discussions of the truth. It just slides. It just slides off his back. He understands that the only solution to false populism is populism guided by moral fortitude. You can't stop populism. You can't stop people deciding that the corruption is enough. Because people are the most powerful resource that a country has. If they band together, you cannot stop them. We learned that in 2016. We learned it hard. Like a fucking truck. Right to the head. You can't stop populism. Is populism good or bad is the wrong question. It's there. Like an economic boom or a recession, like a fall in the stock market, these are inevitabilities of the economy, of the country, of the politics, of any country, of any democracy. That people will eventually get fed up of stagnant conditions and they will rise up. Bernie understands that. And he says, if there's going to be populism in America, which is, by the way, the only thing that has actually fueled real change, it wasn't FDR that brought us the 5-day work week. He championed the movement that fought for the 5-day work week. It was economic angst that brought us labor reforms, that brought us Social Security, the New Deal. It was racial angst. It was democratic action. People banding together and marching for rights. Liberals did not end segregation. They were simply open to the idea when enough people pressured them to do it. Bernie understands that. The government's not going to end this. The people have to collect, and they have to say enough. And you need a leader in place who is willing to listen and acquiesce. He empowers the people who are going to make the change. And he fights for a government that will facilitate it. He understands that the only solution to false populism is populism guided by moral fortitude. That the best solution to rural Americans' fear of the other is to humanize that other under a shared class struggle. And this is the myth of class reductionism. And when I say the myth of class reductionism, I'm not talking about the fact that class reductionism doesn't exist. It does. And it's dumb. I've talked to people who genuinely believe that like sexism and racism are not real issues and that the main issue is class and class will fix everything. Those are fringes and they don't matter. Bernie's not a class reductionist and his movement is not class reductionist. But he knows that when you talk about socioeconomic conditions, which are salient and ubiquitous, that you unite these people who might be afraid of each other. And you say, this is a problem that you all share. And you build solidarity, and through that solidarity, you build empathy. And through that empathy, you build something deeper than just, I don't know who that person is, because it solves the problem of the other. It solves the problem of the exotic, of the unknown, the fear of the unknown that all humans have. If I'm a white rural worker, and I support Bernie because he's going to solve my issues, but I'm afraid of, some random immigrant working like a blue-collar 10-hour-a-day job. And I think that person's stolen my job or whatever. Or if I'm just scared of them because they're different and brown. The knowledge that this person and I have this very, very salient struggle in common. That's a building link. That's a mapping right there. That's a mapping between two people who had no other connection and had every right to be had every reason psychologically to be afraid of one another. But they know that they're struggling against the same corporate plutocratic complex. That's a link that only Bernie knows how to draw because he addresses those issues. So to repeat, he understands that the best solution to rural Americans' fear of the other is to humanize said other under a shared class struggle. It's hard to get smeared in an election where you make absolutely none of your campaign about you. Not me, us. How are you going to implement Medicare for all? What's his answer? I'm not going to, you are. You have to come together and fight for it. You are going to have to primary your congressman, your senator. Protest outside of their office. Support grassroots candidates. End corporate funding. Political, democratic, upwards pressure. It's the only thing that's going to get this passed. He understands that. After watching the State of the Union, I am now convinced that for these reasons, Bernie Sanders is the only person with a shrewd, thoughtful strategy that has a realistic chance of beating Trump. I still believe that. If anyone else wins the nomination, I will work hard as I can to prove myself wrong on that. This was before Michael Bloomberg entered the race. I cannot have the same enthusiasm for Michael Bloomberg that I would for anyone else. I will still say you should vote to beat Trump, but I don't know if I can campaign for that guy. If anyone else wins the nomination, I will work hard as I can to prove myself wrong on that. But watching Trump capitalize on all the points that won him 2016, abuse our airwaves to gaslight the American public, while Democrats continue to make the same blunders that led us here, from Iowa to DNC appointments, which are continuing now, and motivated electoral analyses, it behooves us all to look at the landscape and make an honest judgment about how Trump destroyed the Democratic establishment in 2016, and how to avoid losing on the same issues and get him out of office, and then work to change the systems that inevitably led to him. In summary, Yang Gang 2020. That's literally what I wrote. TLDR, Yang Gang 2020. By the way, I wrote that right before Yang dropped out. And just a little prophetic of me, but... So in a nutshell, what this whole thing was about is Democrats win elections by talking about issues. Democrats lose elections by talking about themselves. That's it. And there's one candidate who has spent the entire time talking about the thing that wins Democrats' elections, and has spent the entire time empowering the people who have ever been able to make change in this country. The people. From the March on Washington to women's suffrage. These were women on a hunger strike who were being force-fed by the paternalistic They went on hunger strike, and the patriarchs tried to force food down their throats. Force it. They puked it up. That's what got women the right to vote. It wasn't Woodrow fucking Wilson. It was the women puking their guts out because their husbands were trying to force them to eat, when they said, we're not going to eat until you actually respect us as human beings. That wasn't because one person had a plan. It wasn't because my senator's father was, an immigrant with $20 in his pocket. I'm the child of an immigrant. I have a lot of respect for those people, but it doesn't win elections. And it doesn't get change happening in this country. For that, you need people. You always have, you always will. All that's to say, every career Democrat was right when they said, it is time to put politics and purity tests aside. It is time to unite behind the Democratic frontrunner and try and beat Donald Trump. It's time to nominate and elect Bernie Sanders. Period. Period. No one else can win. I'll do my best. I don't know how to convince people to vote for anyone else. Well, I can convince people to vote for Warren. Even Biden or Buttigieg. I loathe Buttigieg, but I can get people to vote for him. It's the people I can't get to vote for him. That's where the problem is. I can point to potential incremental positives in a Biden, Buttigieg, Klobuchar presidency. I can point to massive positives in a Warren presidency. Not sure I can point to many in a Bloomberg presidency. He doesn't seem like someone who's eager to protect women's autonomy. He doesn't seem like someone who's eager to protect anyone's autonomy. This is somebody who genuinely considers himself to be above other people. And it's shown in his legislative agenda. But if you want somebody who can win, you go with the person who talks issues. You go with the person who harnesses a populism you cannot stop. Elect Bernie. That's it. Okay, so we're about 2 hours and 20 minutes in. What are my last two? I'm not going to take a break. I think I'm just going to... There was a viewer comment I wanted to get to. Yeah, sure. Let's do the viewer comment. This was on my response to the Sam Cedar vegan debate. I was talking about how vegans need to have better optics, and I was kind of taking for granted that, like, my belief on animal rights is that humanity lives in a state where we can actually survive perfectly fine without eating meat or without exploiting or torturing animals. And I think it's probably good for us to head in that direction, and it's good for us to start adopting a worldview in which it's not acceptable to hurt or kill animals for food. And I am something of a vegan. My financial ability is subject to it, or it's subject to my financial ability. So, like, there are times where I just can't afford to eat vegan, and that's fine. Or it's not fine, but it's like I don't have much responsibility in that. And I had a response on my video. Hashtag get wrecked, PhD, says, morality is subjective. We do not owe any moral responsibility to animals. They are lucky that they even get as much as we give them. Morality is subjective is a philosophical cop-out. And I said, unless you're a moral nihilist, which is an unsustainable societal position, basically what you're saying is morality doesn't exist and there's no point trying to make it exist. Ethics is a little more nuanced than, oh, it's subjective, so nothing matters. And the response was, no thanks. Oh, wait, sorry. I never said nothing matters. It isn't nihilism, it's realism. Moral nihilism and moral realism are diametrically opposed. In philosophy, moral realism is the belief that there is an objective morality. Moral nihilism is like the polar opposite. There's no such thing as any morality, and there's no point trying to make one. And the response to that was, philosophy itself is just guesses and theories, nothing but subjectivity. No such thing as moral realism. These are almost opposites in this day and age. Realism does not involve emotions or morals. They are nothing but emotions. Keep in mind, emotions cloud judgment. Emotions must be ignored for the greater good. Too many people want you and I to die because we don't all adhere to their personal beliefs. So I just say, fuck all emotions and deal with it logically. Emotions can never beat fact. Philosophy is a fool's game. Moral realism does not exist. Morals are too subjective to be realistic. Realism is objective facts, not feelings or emotions. Philosophy is a fool's game. You can think, ponder, and pray all day. Unless you have above average intelligence, you will never reach a reasonable conclusion. A lot of our smartest idols haven't even accomplished that, and you're not even genius level. So why should anyone listen to you? First off, you have not seen enough of my content to know that I'm not a genius. The only way to fix that is to smash that subscribe button right there. The little bell. See that bell? Click the bell. Watch at least 10 to 12 hours of my content, and then at that point you can probably judge that I'm not genius level. I mean, whether or not I'm genius level. But until you've done that, I don't think that you have an adequate sample size, really, statistically speaking. And I am somebody who has no education in statistics, but I can tell you that, like, that's a statistical sample. If you've watched hundreds of YouTube videos of mine, you probably have a good idea as to whether I'm a genius. So, of course, the problem with this statement is that you're saying, like, philosophy is bullshit, so think in logic. Logic comes from philosophy. Logic exists because of philosophy. Logic is a construct to explain that there are things that we believe and perceive and understand to be true without having any empirical data to say so. 2 + 2 = 4 has no manifestation in real life. I mean, you can create real-world examples, but the concept of counting, the concept of quantification, these are systems of rationalism. These are systems of ways of thinking about the world that only exist because they exist within our minds. Things that you can count, the concept of counting, the concept of numbers, the concept of quantities, only exists within the human mind, the human reasoning ability. It's possible that other animals can do it too, that it exists within their minds. Logic, philosophy, empiricism, all of these are products of our perception and our ways of looking at the world. And you have to make certain presuppositions, pre-assumptions about what you're seeing and what you're perceiving, such as what I am seeing and what I am perceiving is my best form of evidence of understanding what is true, right? So that's like, that's the only way that you can start to form any kind of system of logic, is if you ultimately trust that what you're seeing, all of which is subjective, because everything that you perceive is subjective because you're perceiving it. It is filtered by your experience. But you have to accept that there's some level of truth to what you're seeing. And that if other people around you are seeing what you're seeing and you're perceiving them to be perceiving what you're perceiving, then you can start to form a consensus. And that even if you can't 100% trust that consensus, it's the only thing you can trust. That's what philosophy is. It's understanding what knowledge is, how to know things. It's understanding what logic is and where it fits in. So you can't dismiss philosophy as a fool's game while touting philosophy's, like, one of philosophy's most important contributions to humanity, which is the development of logic, which is the core of all of math. It's the core of all reasoning. Has not typically let us down yet. It's also developed empiricism. This might be a troll. Very possibly is a troll. Or it might just be some moron in the YouTube comment section who just doesn't know anything about anything. But I just thought I'd respond to it for a little fun. And by the way, like, if there's any philosophers watching this and I've gotten anything wrong, I've tried to stay as surface level as I can because I'm not actually, like, I have a pretty basic, like, foundational understanding of epistemology and philosophy. So if you want to correct me on anything, feel free to do so. But I definitely understand more than this guy. Or maybe I don't. Maybe my entire perception of reality is completely false, and that this is the only thing that I'm perceiving that's accurate, and it's creating and there's an entire reality that I'm not perceiving, because my sense data is super flawed, except for accurately perceiving what this one person is saying. He's breaking through the ice. I'm in the cave. He's left the cave and he's coming back to me. It's possible that #GetWrecked has left the cave, and he's trying to tell me about what's outside the cave. That moral realism doesn't exist outside of the cave. That moral nihilism is no such thing, and that realism is objective facts. If that's true, I encourage more people outside the cave to come back in and tell me. Because it's pretty dark in here, and the food's not very tasty. All right. The final story, we're going to end with a nice big shout out. A nice, great, wonderful, wobulous, feel good, comfy shout out. It's been a really depressing episode. It's been a very long episode. I wanted to cover a lot of topics, and I'm running way behind schedule. Holy shit, I am totally screwed for my schedule later today. But this is the big shout out. It's going to be a shout out to the fine congressman from California. So when I was growing up as an Indian American boy, there was one role model that really Indian Americans had that was prominent. And that role model was Apu from The Simpsons. A big, giant, walking, talking stereotype. Lovable, funny. We enjoyed him. Didn't turn out so well for us in the schoolyard because we were constantly bullied and teased and mocked and had our entire existence reduced to a punchline from a stereotype episode of a show built on stereotypes. But that was the pinnacle of our representation. Not really a role model, just a comedy figure. And he has admirable characteristics, but he's a cartoon designed to make people laugh by making fun of him, like every other character on The Simpsons. I spent like a solid 4 or 5 seconds shedding real tears. At least 2 of them. Because I saw this story. I sat up in my seat. I realized Indian youth, Indian men, Indian boys grow up today and they're represented by someone like Ro Khanna, who is the national co-chair of the Bernie Sanders campaign. But that's not why I'm spotlighting him and shouting him out right now. I am shouting him out right now because he introduced a bill in Congress that is pushing to recognize third and or neutral genders as options on American passports. And on a basic surface, super political level, it shows you what the power and breadth of the Not Me Us campaign is. A straight, run-of-the-mill, 40-year-old Gen X Indian American man North Indian American man who has every demographic reason to be super conservative, super backward thinking, managerial class, exactly the kind of profile of a person who would come here, be super center liberal, and go back to India and vote BJP. But instead, this is somebody who has an unbelievable amount of solidarity for marginalized communities, who fights for the trans community, who fights for the non-binary community, who is outwardly critical of BJP and Modi, and who I'll bet has had a very non-zero influence on Bernie Sanders' aggressive attention. Of course, Bernie has a sentiment of global solidarity that he's always had. But his marked criticism of the BJP government in India, before even in America, non-Indians understood how venomous and disgusting the BJP government was. And these are barriers that Khanna has not been afraid to break. I'm not sure whether to call him Rokana or Rokana. He pronounces it Khanna in advertisements, so I generally just respect the way that people pronounce their own names in public. So he introduced that bill, and it seems like such a small thing. It's not. But even within the limits of what it is, which is just like introducing a bill to show solidarity with the trans community, those moments are so important because you're talking about a community that is under so much threat. Transphobic murder and transphobic violence are a national epidemic. And the reason that every single story about a trans or non-binary or gender non-conforming person being killed because they were not cisgender. And you hear every story and you're like, why do you just pick out every story? Because this is a community that is very, very, very small and gets a lot of negative attention from their immediate environments. And by negative attention, I'm talking violence. There are very few of them. They're under physical and existential threat. So when a prominent congressman and a co-chair of the frontrunner campaign for president comes out and says, we need to recognize more than two genders on state IDs, that is a huge statement to the non-binary community. Not huge enough. For a bigger message, for a more complete message, it's going to take all of us showing that solidarity. I have a bedrock rule that I violate all the time of not getting into political debates on social media anymore. In fact, I don't even have that rule anymore. I violated it so many times. But the hard exception I have to that rule is that I make a point of vocally attacking transphobes. Technically speaking, I qualify as part of the transgender non-conforming community because I don't conform to binary gender. My pronouns are they, them. But I have cis male privilege. I'm perceived as a man. I identify mostly as male expressing. I reject most forms of the gender binary. I'm a gender abolitionist in deep utopian view. But my reasons for having they them pronouns is not because I have like a dysphoric dissatisfaction with my being classified as a man, but because I have a different issues with the expectations that are held against me, and those have very, very deep implications for me. So I'm technically gender nonconforming, but I'm also cis. It's complicated, but I can't escape my privilege any more than I can escape the gender roles that are levied at me, no matter how much I try and get my immediate environment to call me they them, and they do, and they're respectful, and I appreciate that. Ultimately, my being perceived as a man is laden with exceptions, but it's also laden with privileges, and I cannot escape that. So yes, I have cis privilege. I am a part of the cis blanket in terms of privilege, but I also have like a link to gender nonconforming people, in that I am gender nonconforming. I don't face the issues that, that transitioning non-binary people do. I don't face the issues that people who conform less to male traits or less to stereotypically male archetypes than I do. And that's a large spectrum on which I sit on the more privileged side. And I'm not interested in stolen valor, right? And I identify with the gender nonconforming community in as much as it helps build solidarity and it helps me personally self-actualize. So my relationship with the trans community, with the non-binary community, is one largely of allyship. So yeah, don't waste time getting into Twitter fights. Don't waste time getting into Facebook comment thread fights. But if you're going to, make sure it's on the fights that matter. Because these are the communities that are so threatened. Immigrant communities, and the trans community. These are people who are way outnumbered. And the rhetoric against them fuels the violence against them. And your fervent opposition to those voices does actually play a role. There is actual praxis in there. Talking about Medicare for All in a Facebook thread is not going to get Medicare for All passed. Fighting over it is not going to increase popular opinion. Electing someone who wants to enact Medicare for All is going to. That said, full-throated and unapologetic defenses of the most marginalized among us is part of the reason I advocate for tactical voting. It's part of the reason that it is okay to get in a fight with your transphobic or xenophobic uncle on Facebook every now and then, or in your WhatsApp group. And there's value in there, as long as it's in public, right? If you have like that non-binary cousin in your WhatsApp group and your uncle doesn't know, and he's talking about how, blah, 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 Stephen Crowder, there are only two genders, changing my mind. You make that full-throated defense and you do it for their benefit, because one of the worst parts of being in such a marginalized community, in an immigrant or trans community especially, is the isolation. Break that isolation. That's what Ro Khanna just did. And he did it with a material effort. So huge shout outs to Ro Khanna, absolute role model, and I'm for the first time in a very long time, not in a very long time, but for one of the few times in a very long time, that I am profoundly and very, very overtly proud to be an Indian man. Man with an asterisk, but such that I am. Is seeing myself represented by incredible people like this. So that's going to be it for me. I went an hour and 40 minutes over my intended time, but I felt like today was a very productive episode. I appreciate anyone who tuned in, and if you're interested, check out the RK Roundup on YouTube for the VODs. If you're interested in supporting the channel, the best thing you can do is subscribe to the YouTube channel, and like, comment on my videos, and share them with your friends. But if you're interested in supporting the show, I don't have a paid subscription model currently. You can subscribe to my Twitch if you like, but you're supporting my Twitch gaming channel, which isn't technically my politics channel. But send me a message just saying that you subscribe because of my politics content, and I'll keep that in mind. Otherwise, you can also use the tip jar of my Streamlabs donation on the Twitch channel and just mention that you're supporting the RK Roundup, and I will obviously very much appreciate that if you're interested and you really, really, really want to support. And obviously, if I come out with a paid subscription model and I'm looking to comp subscriptions, I will be looking back at people who supported me, especially when I was starting out, and I will be generously taking that into account. Though not half as generously as you were taking me into account when you decided to donate to me. But none of that is obligatory. The main thing you can do to encourage me to make more content is to engage with it on YouTube and share it with your friends. So I appreciate everyone's eyeballs, and I hope you have a wonderful day and a wonderful week. And if you want to beat Trump, start getting on the phones, and let's win Super Tuesday. Peace out.